A word before we step into this one. If the sort of telling I'm about to lay out here is the kind that sits with you, that you'd want not one but 10 of, each one carried through to the end in a voice that belongs to the dark, there is a collection waiting. What the Mountain Keeps. 10 files pulled from 10 counties across 5 states, spanning 1893 to 1955. Every one of them a climb into ground that looked simple from the start. Every one signed off by the law with the wrong word. 10 hours to settle into the black with, from beginning to close. The link lives in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. If nothing else tonight, put it on your list for later. Now then, there are hollows in these ridges where the earth doesn't forget what it took in. Places the trail curls around without you noticing why. Places the old-timers won't walk past sundown and won't explain if you press them on it. You can drive through a fair stretch of this country, now on roads carved out in the 30s, and you can glance off the shoulder into a stand of poplar and never know from the road that a settlement once lay back in there. You won't know that 130 years gone, a wagon trace ran past those trees, led to a church and a mill and a well. You won't know the name. The newer books left it out. Before we go further, let me ask you something. Wherever you're listening from, whatever hour's showing on your side of the wall, drop the name of your place in the comments. I like knowing where these stories land. And if you've ever been out on a stretch of country and felt it watching you back, felt it go still around you the way a room goes still when someone's just stopped mid-sentence. Say that too. Say it plain. I read every one. What follows is the record of Cassian Marrowbone, a topographer with the United States Geological Survey, and the 4 days he spent in a hollow the maps had already started to forget by the autumn of 1894. By that fall, Cassian Marrowbone had been walking ridges for the government for 11 years. He was 38, a long, quiet frame of a man, 6 foot and change. Lean through the waist and broader through the shoulders, with a stoop he'd picked up from hauling a heavy transit and a chain over uneven ground since he was 27. His hair had gone the color of tea left out too long. His eyes were pale gray, so faint that folks in the mountain towns took him more than once for a preacher. He was not. He was a man who put lines on paper for a living. And the lines, when he drew them right, made the country legible to men in Washington who'd never lay eyes on it. He'd been sent up to fill a gap. The survey had a rough sketch of the ridge west of Boone in the high country of North Carolina from a party that had passed through in the 70s. The sketch showed a hollow drawn small, and the name of the hollow was written in a hand that had grown shaky by the time it reached the second word, Cricutwell. That was all it said, Cricutwell, and a faint line where a wagon trace was thought to run. No elevations, no dwellings marked, no church, no mill, no cemetery. Nothing that suggested people had ever lived there. And yet in the county book back in Watauga, when Cassian looked, there was Cricutwell listed as a settlement with a tax roll of 41 souls in 1868 and 1869 and 1870. Then the roll stopped. No note of why it stopped. The next year's book had a line drawn through the name and beside it, in a different ink, the word cleared. Cleared. That was the word that had brought Cassian up early to take a room at Verley Hensley's boarding house in the town of Fenner's Ford. He'd used that word himself on other assignments, and he knew what it meant on paper. It meant the settlement was gone, taxes uncollected, dwellings removed or unfit. Cleared meant a decision had been made, and made cleanly, by someone with the authority to make it. What cleared did not mean in Cassian's experience was that 41 people had walked out of a hollow between one tax year and the next and left no forwarding address to any other book in the county or the counties around it, or in the whole state. Mrs. Hensley was a widow of 54, small and dry-boned, with a mouth that pursed the way some old women's mouths do when they're holding something back behind their teeth. She'd been raised in these mountains. She fed him beans and salt pork and a piece of cornbread the size of his fist. She watched him eat. She said very little for 2 nights. On the 3rd night, when he asked her straight out and gently whether she'd ever heard tell of a place called Cricutwell, her hand paused on the way to the coffee pot, and she said, without looking at him, that she'd heard the name in her mother's kitchen and had not heard it since. He asked what her mother had said about it. She said her mother had said only that there was a hollow above the North Fork of the Craven, and that a person could walk into it if they were determined, and that a person could walk out of it if they were determined, and that no one in her mother's memory had ever gone in and come out in the same shape they went in with. She said that. Then she said the coffee was ready, and she did not say anything else about it that evening or the next. The morning Cassian left for the ridge, she gave him a piece of blackberry pie in a square of waxed paper and put her small dry hand on his forearm. She said, "Don't go up past the mill wheel after the light starts to go." She said it that way, plain, the way you'd tell a man not to leave a pot on the stove. Then she took her hand back and turned away, and he understood he was not to ask her which mill wheel. The wagon trace, when he found it, was where the old sketch said it would be. That was the first surprise. Cassian had learned to expect old wagon traces to be washed to nothing after 30 years, overrun by rhododendron and blackberry, forgotten by any deer that hadn't been born on them. This one was not washed to nothing. It was still a road. Grass had come up in the ruts, but the ruts were there, and more than that. The grass had been cut, not mowed, cut by hand close, the way a man will scythe a strip of ground when he means to keep the way open without letting on that he means to keep it. Someone was tending the trace. He put that in his book. By noon of the first day he'd walked, by his own reckoning, 4 miles up the trace and had gained maybe 700 feet. The trees closed over him, poplars and oaks, some of them thicker at the base than a man could reach around. The undergrowth thinned out the way it does in old growth stands where the canopy's been closed long enough to shade out the brambles. Cassian was pleased by that at first. It was easier walking than he'd planned for. Then he realized he could not hear anything. I don't mean he couldn't hear people. That was to be expected 4 miles from a town of 600. I mean he couldn't hear the woods. There were no jays calling, no chickadees moving through the middle branches, no squirrels barking at him from the trunks. The wind was moving. He could see the tops of the poplars turning against the light, but the wind was not making any sound down where he was standing. He stood still for a long minute and listened for his own breath and heard it, and was reassured. In the small ways a man reassures himself when there's nothing else to reassure him. And he kept walking, because he'd been sent, and because he had 11 years of ridges behind him, and because he'd never yet turned back on a piece of country he'd been paid to draw. The trace came around a shoulder of the ridge and dropped into the hollow just as the light was turning to the flat gold of mid-afternoon. And there was Cricutwell. There were 17 houses. Cassian counted them twice. He counted them because there'd been 41 souls on the last tax roll, and because 17 houses was about right for 41 souls in this country in that decade, and because he was at bottom a man who took comfort in numbers matching. The houses were laid out along the trace, which became a small street where it hit the hollow floor. There was a common at the center with a well in the middle of it. There was a mill at the low end of the common where a small creek ran. There was a church at the high end with a plain white steeple, and there was a burying ground behind the church up the slope inside a low wall of piled stone. It was, in every way he could name, a proper Appalachian settlement of the middle 60s. It looked like a picture out of a history book, except that it should not have been standing. 34 years near enough since the roll had gone quiet. 34 winters. 34 springs of rain running off the ridge. 34 summers of hardwood roots pushing up under floors. In this country, in that time, a house untended goes back to the ground. The roof shingles curl and fall. The chimney parts from the wall. The joists sag, the porch drops, the windows blow out in the first hard winter. In 34 years, a house in these mountains is a rectangle in the leaf mold, and a stack of stones where the hearth used to be. In 34 years, a whole town is a shape you can find only by looking down from the ridge in winter, when the snow lies different, where the walls used to be. Cricutwell was not that. Cricutwell was standing. The roofs were on. The doors were on their hinges. The windows had their glass, and the glass was clean. Cassian stood on the shoulder of the trace and did not go down for a long moment. He got his transit off his shoulder and set it on the ground and sat next to it with his back against a poplar. He drank a mouthful of water from his canteen. He thought carefully about what he was seeing. There were 3 explanations he could think of. He wrote them in his book in order. 1, someone had rebuilt the town. Not likely. There was no reason. No road better than the wagon trace. No market close enough to make it worth the doing, and no one in Fenner's Ford or in the county book who had claimed any parcel in Cricutwell in the 34 years since the roll had gone quiet. 2, someone had been keeping the town. That was possible. He'd already noted that the trace was tended. A caretaker. Maybe some old man from a nearby cove, walking up every season to patch a roof, mend a shutter. It was possible. It was not likely for the same reasons that made the first explanation unlikely, but it was possible. 3. The town had not been abandoned in 1870 at all, which meant the tax roll was wrong, which meant the word cleared was wrong, which meant something. He put the book away. He picked up the transit, and he walked down the trace into Cricutwell. The houses were not empty. That was the second surprise, and it was the one that stayed with him longer than the first. I don't mean there were people in them. There were not. He knocked at the first door he came to, and no one answered. He tried the latch, and the door opened, and he called out a hello, and no one called back. But there were things in the house. There was a table set for 4 with 4 earthenware plates and 4 spoons and a cast iron pot in the middle with a lid on. He took the lid off. There was nothing in the pot. It had been washed clean, but it was set on the table in the middle with its lid on. The way a person sets a pot before they call the family in for supper. The beds upstairs were made, not made up like a hotel bed. Tight and squared, made the way people make their beds when they mean to sleep in them again that night. The quilts were pulled up. The pillows were turned. There was a folded shirt on the chest at the foot of the bed, and the shirt was clean, and it had not been folded 34 years. He could tell by the way the crease sat. Cloth folded 34 years takes the crease into itself, dark and permanent. This shirt had been folded that week. He went to the next house. The next house was the same, not set for 4, set for 2, but set. The beds were made. There was a coat on a hook by the door, and the coat was heavy wool, and the wool was not moth-eaten, and the pockets, when he checked them, held a folded handkerchief and a small tin of chewing tobacco. The tobacco, when he opened the tin, was fresh. He went to 7 houses that afternoon. 7 of the 17. Each one was set. Each one was made. Each one had something in it that had been touched by a hand. Not 4 years ago, but recently. In some houses, kettles were on stoves with wood laid in the box beside. In one house, a loom stood with cloth on it, half finished. And the shuttle was on the bench beside the loom, and the last thread was still bright, still holding its dye. He did not go in the church that first afternoon. He did not go up to the burying ground. He did not go near the mill. He walked back up the trace to the shoulder of the ridge, and he set up his tent under the poplar where he'd rested, and he built a small fire, and he ate a piece of the pie Verley Hensley had given him, and he wrote in his book one line. It said, "The town is not abandoned, but no one lives here." Then he closed the book and sat with his back to the tree and watched the light go out of the hollow below him. That was when he heard the mill wheel. I want you to understand what I mean. There was a creek at the low end of Cricutwell. He'd seen it. It was not a strong creek, the kind a man could step across without wetting his boots. There was not enough water in it on that late afternoon, in dry autumn, to turn a mill wheel. And yet from the tent, in the last blue of the light, Cassian heard very plainly the sound of a mill wheel turning, the wet slap of a paddle coming down, the slow gurgle of the water taking it up again, the creak of the axle in its cradle. He heard it turn 6 times, then it stopped. He got up and walked to the edge of the shoulder and looked down into the hollow. The mill was there at the low end of the common, where it had been that afternoon. He could just make it out in the failing light. The wheel was not turning. It was hanging still on its axle. There was no water on it. There had been no water on it. The creek beside it was as low as it had been at noon. He went back to the fire and sat down and did not sleep well. The second day he went down early. The dawn came up over the ridge behind him and washed the hollow in a color like old brass. And he took his book and his pencil and his transit, and he went down. He measured. That was the honest work of it. That was what he'd been sent to do. He set the transit at the center of the common by the well, and he ran his sightings out to the 4 corners of the settlement, and he wrote his angles and his distances and his notes. He measured the well. It was 31 feet from the coping down to the water, which was clean and cold. When he lowered the bucket, he drank a swallow, and it tasted like water. That was the third surprise. He would have expected, given everything else, that the water would taste of something. It tasted of nothing. It tasted the way clean well water tastes, which is the taste of very little at all. He measured the church. It was a plain box with a plain steeple, 26 feet on the long side and 18 on the short. The door had a wooden latch. The latch worked. He went inside. The pews were oak. There were 9 of them, 4 on the left, 5 on the right, and every one of them was polished. The wood shone. There was no dust on the pulpit. There was a Bible open on the pulpit, and the Bible was open to the book of Job, and the ribbon was laid across the page like it had been laid there by a hand that meant to come back to it. He read the passage under the ribbon. It said, "The earth is given into the hand of the wicked, and God covereth the faces of the judges." He closed the Bible. He did not know why he closed it. He noticed after he'd closed it that his hand was shaking a little, and he put the hand in his coat pocket and stood in the middle of the church and made himself breathe until the shaking stopped. There was a small door behind the pulpit. He went through it. It gave onto a small room that had been plainly the pastor's study. There was a desk. There was a chair. There was a shelf with 3 books on it. There was a ledger. The ledger was what Cassian had come to find without knowing he'd come to find it. He took it off the shelf and sat down in the pastor's chair and put the ledger on the pastor's desk and opened it. It was the book of the settlement. The record births, marriages, deaths, names, dates, pastoral notes. The hand was neat and slanted forward. The hand of a man who wrote a great deal and did not linger over it. The first entry was from 1848. The last entry was from the 11th of October, 1870. There were 312 entries. Cassian read them all. The entries for 1870 were not the entries of a town preparing to be cleared. They were the entries of a town going about its year. A marriage in April, a burial in June, a corn crop in September that the pastor called middling in a note beside the tithe. Then, in the first week of October, the entries began to change. The pastor stopped writing about the town. He began writing about a sound. That was what he called it in the ledger. The sound. He described it as a sound like a mill wheel turning, where there was no mill wheel to turn. He described it as the sound of many footsteps on wood at an hour when the town was in its beds. He described it as the sound of a woman singing something low in the church at 3 in the morning when the church was locked and the key was on his own belt. He described walking to the church in the dark on the 4th of October and finding the door open and finding no one inside and finding on the pulpit the Bible open to the book of Job and the ribbon across the page. Though he had locked the Bible closed when he locked the door the evening before. The last entry was the 11th. It said, "We have determined to go, all of us together, before the light." It said, "We go with our own consent, and by our own hands upon the doors of our own houses, and we go without haste, and we take with us what we can carry that we know is ours." It said, "If the Lord will have us to come out on the other side of this ridge, we shall come out. And if the Lord will have us not, we shall not, and either shall be well." It was signed in a different hand with only 2 initials, EC, and below the initials, in a third hand and in a different ink, there was one line. It said, "They went," and nothing else. Cassian closed the ledger. He carried it back to the shelf. He put it on the shelf. He walked out of the pastor's study, through the church, out the door, and did not close the door behind him. He crossed the common. He did not look at the well. He did not look at the mill. He went up the trace to the shoulder of the ridge, and he sat down at his fire, and he did not eat, and he wrote nothing in his book for 2 hours. When at last he did write, he wrote a single line. It said, "They did not clear the town." The town went. He should have gone down that evening. He knew it after. He said it later to a man who had reason to ask him. He should have folded the tent and taken the transit and walked back down the trace to Fenner's Ford and let the government send another man for the maps if the government wanted the maps. He did not. He was 38 years old, and he had a stubbornness in him that had been useful to him in his working life, and had also more than once put him in country he had no business being in. He built his fire up, and he ate what he could make himself eat. And he told himself in the sensible voice he kept for talking to himself, when the other voice would not do that. He'd come a long way to draw a map, and that he would draw the map, and that the map would be the end of it. He sat by the fire until the fire was down to embers. He crawled into his tent. He pulled his coat over him. He closed his eyes. He did not hear the mill wheel that night. He heard something else. He heard a woman singing. She was a long way off, down in the hollow. He could not make out the words. He could not tell if the words were words, or if the sound was only the shape of a woman singing, without any words at all. He lay in the dark and listened, and he found that his hand had gone up to his chest without his telling it, to and had taken hold of the shirt over his heart, and was holding on. He made his hand let go. He made himself count the singing. He counted 17 breaths of it, and then the singing stopped, and there was a stretch of silence. And then it began again, a little closer, and he counted 11 breaths of it, and then it stopped. The third time it was closer still, in the trees below him. He could hear now that it was not one voice. It was maybe 3, maybe 4. He could hear one voice that was the lead voice, and then the others coming in under it. The Wade voices come in under a lead voice in a song that has been sung many times by the same people. The fourth time he heard footsteps. They were on the trace. They were coming up. They were unhurried. He could hear the small crackle of leaves under a boot, and then a small pause, and then another crackle, and then another pause. Whatever was walking up the trace was walking the way a person walks, when they know exactly where they're going and are not in any hurry to get there. Cassian did what any honest man would have done. He said in a voice he tried to keep steady, "Hello. My name is Cassian Marrowbone, and I am camped up here on survey business, and I would appreciate knowing who I have the pleasure of." The footsteps stopped. They did not go on. They did not go back. They stopped on the trace, maybe 40 feet below him in the dark, where he could not see them, and they could not see him. And they stayed stopped. He listened for a long time. He listened until his ears began to make sounds of their own out of the silence. The way ears do when they've been asked to work too hard. He listened until the moon came up over the ridge and the trees began to make shadows on the ground outside his tent. Then, at what he judged to be near 3 in the morning, the singing began again. But it was no longer down in the hollow. It was on the trace. It was where the footsteps had been. Take a breath here before what comes next. If this is the kind of case you would want to sit with in the dark, not just hear it once, but keep it. There is a collection I put together with the people at Forbidden Unresolved Stories. What the Mountain Keeps. 10 complete cases. 8 hours 60, 2 years of records nobody wanted to finish. Every one of them placed, dated, and signed off with a tidy word that never once fit what happened. The link is in the description below and at the top of the comments. Put it on somewhere quiet. Let it run. And while we're taking a breath, have you ever been out under a sky and heard something in the trees that was not any bird you knew and not any voice you knew and not the wind? Have you ever answered it and been sorry you answered? Say it in the comments. Say what you heard. Say what you did after. I read them. I will read yours now. Cassian Marrowbone. The third day, he did not remember falling asleep. He remembered lying in his tent in the sound of the singing on the trace. And he remembered the singing going on for a long time, and then the singing being farther off, and then farther, and then very faint, and then gone. He remembered opening his eyes, and it was morning. The fire was cold. His book was on the ground where he'd left it. His transit was where he'd set it, against the poplar. Nothing had been moved. He sat up. He made himself coffee. He made himself eat a piece of the bread and a wedge of the cheese Verley Hensley had put in his pack. He made himself do these things in order, because he understood with a clean, cold understanding of a man who has taken his own measure that he had one more day in him for Cricutwell, and then he would leave. He had come to draw the map. He would draw the map. He would draw it that day. Then he would go. He went down the trace with his transit on his shoulder, and did not look at the common, and did not look at the mill, and did not look at the church. He walked the perimeter of the hollow, because that was what he'd come to do. He set his transit at the 4 points of the compass, and he ran his sightings, and he wrote his notes. He worked until noon, and then he ate standing without sitting down. He worked through the afternoon. He got what he needed for the map. He got it clean. Then he did the thing he'd told himself all morning he would not do. He went up to the burying ground. It was a small burying ground behind the church up the slope inside the low wall of piled stone. There were 39 headstones. Cassian counted them because he'd been counting since he arrived and could not stop. 39 and 40. 1 souls on the last tax roll, plus the 22 years of births he'd read in the ledger, less the deaths he'd read in the ledger. He did the arithmetic in his head as he walked between the stones, and the arithmetic did not come out right, but it was close enough that he did not press it. The stones were plain sandstone. Some had lost their carving. The oldest was from 1849, less than a year after the first ledger entry. A woman named Olia Wickman, who had died in her 32nd year of what the ledger had called a fever of the lung. The stone was worn but readable. Cassian moved on. The stones went in order. The dead were laid down in the order they had died, in rows, the way a small settlement lays its dead down when there is no one to disagree about it. Cassian walked the rows. He read the names. He noted the dates. He did what a man does in a burying ground when he does not know what else to do. He came to the last row. Every stone in the last row had the same date on it, the 11th of October, 1870. There were 22 of them. Cassian stood at the end of the row for a long time. The wind was moving in the tops of the poplars above the wall. He could not hear it. He counted the stones in the row again. 22. He read the names. He wrote them down. Some of the names were in the ledger, some were not. That surprised him at first, and then he understood. And he wrote in his book in the margin below the names that the stones did not need to match the ledger, because the stones had not been carved by the people of the settlement. The stones had been carved after, by whom he did not know. And there was one more thing under the 22 stones. If you added them to the deaths already recorded in the ledger, you got 63. 63 souls dead in Cricutwell between 1848 and the 11th of October, 1870. 41 souls per the tax roll of 1870. 19 surplus. The 19 did not fit anywhere. They were not in the ledger as deaths. They were not on the tax rolls as souls. They were on stones in the row with the same date on them as the others. Names Cassian did not know. Names the pastor had not written down. He was at that moment standing on the row. I do not mean he was standing beside it. I mean he was standing on it. The stones were set flat into the ground, not upright, because the last row had run out of the burying ground and had run down the slope, and someone had laid them flat and had piled the earth over them so that the row lay under the grass. He had walked out onto them without noticing. His boots were on the 22nd name. He looked down at his boots. The grass around them was greener than the grass on the rest of the burying ground. He had not noticed that until he was standing on it. He stepped off very slowly. He took the 2 steps that put him back inside the wall of piled stone. He put the wall between himself and the row. He did not turn his back to the row. He backed away from it, watching the stones until his back met the wall of the church. Then he went around the church and down the common and up the trace. And he did not run, because he did not want to run, because a man who has been 11 years on ridges does not run. But he did not stop either until he was at his tent. He did not sit down when he got there. He struck the tent. He put his things in his pack. He put the transit on his shoulder, and he walked back down the trace toward Fenner's Ford. And he did not stop until it was dark. And when it was dark, he made a small fire in the middle of the trace itself, and he sat on his pack. And he did not sleep. He got back to Fenner's Ford at noon of the 4th day, Verley Hensley took one look at him standing on her porch, and she did not ask him where he'd been, and she did not ask him what he'd seen. She fed him. She put a bowl in front of him and a spoon beside it. And she sat across from him at the table and watched him eat. And when he was done, she took the bowl away and she sat back down and she looked at him. She said, "Was the burying ground how they say?" He said, "Mom, I don't know what they say, but I don't imagine what they say is far off." She nodded. She said, "Did you take anything out?" He understood then why she was asking. He said, "No, ma'am, I did not." She nodded again. She said, "That's well." He said, "The ledger in the church. There is a ledger in the church." She said, "I know." He said, "Do you know what it says?" She said, "I know what it says. My mother read it. My mother's mother read it. My mother's mother was born in Cricutwell in 1852, and she walked out of it in 1870 with her own consent and by her own hand upon the door of her own house, and she took with her what she could carry that she knew was hers, and she did not go back." He said, "Ma'am." He did not know what else to say. "Madam, forgive me. There are 22 graves in the last row dated the same day, and there are 19 more under the grass, and your mother's mother walked out." Verley Hensley looked at him with her small, dry eyes for what he later remembered as a long time. She said, "Some of them walked out. Some of them did not. That was the choice that night. Some walked out. Some stayed. Those that stayed are under the grass. That is what the ledger did not write. That is what nobody wrote. My mother's mother told it to my mother in her last week, and my mother told it to me in her last month. And I have not told it to anyone, because there is no one to tell it to who has a right to know. But you were up there. You were in the church. You stood on the row. You have a right to know." He said, "Ma'am, what were they? What made them go?" She said, "I will not answer that." My mother's mother would not answer it. She said, when she was asked that, "A person who has not been there has no right to know." She said, when she was asked that, "A person who has been there does not need to be told." She said, when she was asked that, "The mountain keeps what the mountain keeps." She stood up. She said, "You will not draw the map." He said, "Ma'am, I have already drawn the map." She said, "You will not send the map." He looked at her. She looked at him. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "No, ma'am, I will not send it." She nodded. She said, "You can stay the night. You should go in the morning. You should go a long way, and you should not come back." He said, "Yes, ma'am." He slept that night in the small back room where she'd put him. He slept badly. He dreamed of the row under the grass. He dreamed of a woman singing on a trace in the dark. He dreamed of a mill wheel turning without water. Once, in the deep part of the night, he woke because he was sure he'd heard somewhere, outside the boarding house, a very faint singing of the same shape and the same voices as the singing he'd heard on the ridge. When he sat up and listened, there was only the wind and the small settling of the beams of the old house. After a while, he slept again. In the morning, he ate what she gave him, and he took his pack, and he took his transit, and he walked out of Fenner's Ford before the light was properly up. He caught the coach at the crossroads. He rode it 3 days to the railhead, and the railroad 5 days to Washington. He sat in a small room at the survey, and he was asked what he'd found in Cricutwell Hollow, and he said plainly that he had not been able to reach the hollow because a windfall had blocked the trace above the second creek, and that in his professional judgment, the settlement was long cleared, and its survey could be safely deferred to a later party. He signed a paper to that effect. He was thanked for his time. He was given his next assignment. He drew maps for the government for 23 more years, and he did his work cleanly, and he never spoke of Cricutwell again. He never went back to the mountains of North Carolina. Sheriff Betheltack of Watauga County, in the folder that carried the name of Cricutwell Hollow, wrote in a note dated November of 1894 that a federal surveyor named Marrowbone had returned from the ridge in good order and had confirmed the settlement as cleared. He signed the note. He put it in the folder. The folder was closed. In every county book that came after, the word beside the name of Cricutwell remained cleared, and no one so far as any record shows corrected it. Cassian Marrowbone died in Baltimore in the spring of 1931 at the age of 65. He was found in his own bed. He'd been a widower for 8 years. He had left on the desk in his study an envelope, unsealed, addressed to no one. Inside the envelope were 4 pages of his own hand. 3 of the pages were the notes he'd made in Cricutwell Hollow, copied out cleanly. The 4th was a single paragraph, written by the shape of the ink on a different night. The paragraph said this: "I never sent the map. I never wrote what I saw. I have gone back only in sleep, and I have gone back most nights. I have counted the stones. I have read the names. I have stood on the row. I have heard the singing on the trace. I do not know what the mountain kept. I know that it keeps it still. And I know that some nights, when I lie a long time awake, I hear very faint a mill wheel turning without water, and I do not need to look to know it is turning for me." The envelope was found by his housekeeper. She did not know what to do with it. She gave it to his cousin. His cousin gave it to a small historical society in the town where Cassian had been raised. It sat in a folder in a drawer for 41 years. In 1972, a young researcher going through the drawer for a thesis on the Geological Survey found it, read it, and copied out the 3 pages of field notes for her thesis. She left the 4th page in the folder. She did not know what to do with it either. The folder is still in that drawer. Cricutwell Hollow on the current maps is not named. The wagon trace is not shown. If you walk the ridge above the North Fork of the Craven, you will not find a sign to point you in, but the trace is still there. Someone is still keeping it. The grass in the ruts is still cut down to the ruts. And in the hollow, at the end of the trace, 17 houses stand with their roofs on, and their windows clean, and their doors on their hinges. The pot is on the table in the first house you come to with its lid on. The Bible is open on the pulpit in the church to the book of Job, and the ribbon lies across the page. The row is under the grass behind the church, and the grass over the row is greener than the grass around it. Sometimes, if you are on the shoulder above the hollow when the light is going and you are quiet and the wind has stopped in the poplars, you can hear very faintly from the low end of the common a mill wheel turning without water. You will not hear it long. It turns 6 times. Always 6. Then it stops. Then, if you are wise, you will go. I think Cassian was wise in the way that mattered. He drew the map and did not send it. He went and did not come back. He heard the mill wheel, and he understood what it was asking, and he refused it. And some of them up in Cricutwell, some of the ones who did not walk out that night in 1870, they refused it too. That is what I think is under the grass in the row. Not what the mountain took. What the mountain kept. Because those who stayed would not be taken. But that is only what I think, and I was not there, and I have no right to know. You and I listening tonight, on your side of the wall and mine, we have no right either. If you have a story like it, a place near where you live that people don't cross, a name that goes quiet on the old rolls without a reason, tell it to me in the comments. Tell it slow. I read them all, and if this is the kind of case you would want more of. 10 of them told out the whole way in a voice made for the dark. The collection is there in the description and at the top of the comments. What the mountain keeps. Sit with us again next time. Sleep well if you can.